On today's edition of the CHGO Cubs podcast, spring training is underway. The Cubs are playing real, organized baseball games. We've got roster battles, DFAs, all of it and more coming up on today's edition of the CHGO Cubs podcast. This is the CHGO Cubs podcast. My name is Corey. I am joined today, not always, by Jared Willis. You can find, of course, all of his work at ALLCITY.com. Jared, appreciate you filling in for Brendan today. And I know I've said this before, but we've had many a conversation on here dating back a long time when it was just Brendan and I, pre-CHGO ever even existing as a concept.
That's right. I think we're closing in on, it's got to be close to a decade of talking baseball, Cubs baseball. So I don't remember exactly, but I feel like it might have been during that 2015 run when we first connected. So yeah, it's been a while.
And here we are. Look
at this now.
Yeah. Look at us now. The Cubs have won a championship since we started talking.
That's right.
They feel a certain distance away from that again, but we're not sure. But as we come to you on this Friday, Cubs and Dodgers opening spring training on Thursday, a lot of non-regulars outside of Michael Busch getting in that game. But that's always one of those kind of moments of the year, Jared. Like I know you and I are both in Illinois or, parts of the Chicagoland area. And it is, in the single digits basically these days. But when the Cubs, they put out a lineup card on Thursday, like they're playing a real earnest game. It does sort of feel like the start of something.
Yes, everything feels a little warmer, a little brighter outside, even though Thursday morning when I got in the car to go, I was headed out and I think my car thermometer said 4 degrees. But I thought to myself, it doesn't matter because the Cubs have a game today. And by, physically I'm in Illinois, but spiritually I'm in Arizona where it's much warmer. So
yes. Spiritually always with the Cubs.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, it does make you feel a little different when you pull up, MLB.com and you start seeing the box scores and the schedule, looking at who's playing. And, I think extra special this year because the Cubs were the very first spring training game. No others played on Thursday. They were it kind of like they will with the regular season.
Yeah,
for a few weeks, but yeah. So always a special day.
Yeah, and an interesting. Obviously, it's a little bit earlier, so something to keep an eye on. Like we do have a sort of unique situation, I suppose, this spring with the early regular season start and, even hearing the opening day, Japan series starters set and, now knowing that Shota is working on this particular timeline. So an interesting thing to sort of keep an eye on versus the regular spring training and everybody kind of having that same runway. But a lot to talk about today. I do, I know it happened on Thursday morning. I do want, Jared and I to offer our thoughts on the Alexander Canario DFA. I think a lot of people kind of surprised by that on Thursday morning. And then I think getting into a lot of the, stuff to watch during these spring training games, because I think often, there's plenty for people to overreact to. I can, envision, if PCA has a 400 OPS in the Cactus League, people are going to lose their minds. Same way, if he puts up a 1200 OPS, people are going to lose their minds.
Either way, we're overreacting.
Yeah. But I think for this Cubs team, there is a lot to watch in these games, I always, and I think plenty of people kind of caution against like digging too much into spring training and the results and focusing more on process and health and things like that. But with the Cubs, and as you saw with someone like Canario, like they do have a lot of guys that don't have options or that do have options, but that, maybe you would think that they would break camp with the team, but that might depend on if they want to cut loose some other guys that maybe are lower on the totem pole, but they don't have as much flexibility there. And that even started on Thursday, Jared, like Gage Workman getting in at third base, hitting a home run in the Cactus League opener. Like that's one of those where obviously it is, it seems to be Matt Shaw's job to lose, but him starting training with the oblique, not an oblique situation seems to be fine, etc. But who's backing up third base? Who would get a significant share of that playing time? Like, how the bullpen is shaking out, the starting rotation to start the year. Like, there are a lot of, they're not the primary stories or the primary players, so to speak. And maybe some of these guys, to the casual fan, perhaps they don't care who's backing up third base or who the, last reliever in the bullpen is, or this guy has options, blah, blah, blah. But I think this is a spring training where the roster is in a lot of ways fairly set, but in a lot of ways they could go a good variety of directions with who they decide to break camp with.
Yeah. And I think some of what we want to look most closely at probably has to do with how they handle, because like you said, it does feel like Matt Shaw is their third baseman. That seems to be the approach that they're taking. That, the way you put it, I think is right. It's his job to lose. However, we all know the reality of this is a guy who has had 0 major league at bats, and to go into a season just thinking that we're just going to slot Matt Shaw in at third base every day and it's going to go great. It might, but it could also, as we know, we've seen with many other players, there's growing pains. There's, times when they come out really hot, the league adjusts to them, and then we see them adjust back really slowly, and it kind of takes a while. I think PCA is a good example of that. So I think figuring out who's going to back him up at third, but also understanding that whoever that backup is will probably, at least at first, play more than your typical backup infielder, your typical utility.
Or they need
player.
To be ready to.
Right. Or at the very least, be prepared to do that in the event that Shaw, really scuffles or really needs to, that they need to play the matchups much more carefully. Like this is almost like a platoon sort of situation. Because, you've got Justin Turner, but I think the thing we also need to remember is he's really kind of the backup or the support for both corner spots of the infield. He's not just there to be third base. He's also there because Michael Busch needs a backup, so to speak. So if I hesitate to even speak this into the universe, but if one of those players gets hurt, Busch or Shaw, then you've got to have Turner playing one of those spots on a pretty much a full-time basis, which then that's where you need a guy like Gage Workman or someone like that.
Yeah.
To be able to step into that role, which is a little bit of why it was kind of a surprise perhaps that Canario did get DFA'd on Thursday. Because we all read, we saw that he was taking the reps at first base, and it looks like they were putting that work toward having him prepared to fill that role if need be. But then, of course, roster realities being what they are when you're talking about players with options and players that don't have those, and a veteran guy like Justin Turner coming in, and just the reality boiling down to who's going to get the roster spot. Those are the battles that you're looking at in spring, is who those guys are going to be. Because we did see last month at the Cubs convention, that was something that both the front office guys and Craig Counsell talked about, was the depth of their bench, because they recognized that as a shortcoming in 2024, a part of why last season did turn out to be something of a disappointment, because they lacked that bench depth.
Yeah.
And it is why some of those familiar faces like Nick Madrigal, Patrick Wisdom. Some of those guys aren't there anymore because that wasn't the bench depth that they needed. So those are the battles to watch for. Maybe you know who most of the roster spots are going to go to, but who fills what roles? That's kind of those are the questions that I think we're all going to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, I think, Canario maybe specifically, or just some of that stuff after our first ad break. But finishing kind of on the positional stuff and depth, I do kind of like the idea, because I saw the one video of Canario like doing picks at first base, like with a bucket and all that other stuff. I kind of like the idea that they did that like for 5 minutes. Like, yeah, no, we got to get Justin Turner in here. Like, no.
This isn't going to work. Yeah.
But I mean, it's hugely important. And, I know it's certainly, we were not alone in this, but if anyone has listened to Dr. Brendan Miller and I for the last couple of years, you have listened to a lot of yelling about bad sub-replacement level players getting too much playing time. It has, without question, been one of the biggest failures of the last couple of years. Like, we talk so much about, the star level talent and free agent acquisitions and trades and all that other stuff. And all of that is important. But all told, the last couple of years, the Cubs have had a very solid group of good players. Maybe they were missing that absolute elite piece. Now they have that in Kyle Tucker. But there was a good group, kind of a good core, so to speak. And it's not the only reason, but it did get weighted down by a bunch of guys with sub-replacement level numbers. On any given day throughout these last couple of years, you had 2-3 guys with a 50, 60 WRC plus, sitting in the bottom of your lineup. Like, that'll kill you, especially when you don't have Shohei Ohtani or Mookie Betts or whoever at the top of that lineup. Like, the Cubs have good players, but unless you have those elite stars, it doesn't cover up blemishes that are that deep. So when Brendan and I last spoke, the Turner thing was only a rumor. I'm quite into that. I'm glad they made that move. I think, as we discussed, like, he really not playing third base the last couple of years. Can he be put there like as a body? It's hard to say. And if that were happening, it would be, things would probably have gone seriously wrong in other areas. So I think, thinking he is there for Bush and DH and, to kind of spell those things, but maybe third base in a pinch. And I really, really like the mentorship potential there for not only Michael Bush, but really Matt Shaw too. Again, I don't know Justin Turner. Maybe he, doesn't like talking to rookies, but he has a very good reputation. So I would expect this. But this is a guy who was non-tendered by the Mets, floating around, probably hanging up the cleats at one point, having accomplished not much at the MLB level, reinvents himself, buys in totally to the launch angle kind of statistical revolution of hitting that was happening at the time, completely transforms his career, like going to go down, certainly not as one of like the greatest Dodgers of all time, but a very highly regarded player during a very significant period of that franchise. And also big leg kick guy, Matt Shaw, leg kick guy, and just all of that put together. And that's not even getting into, being a perennial winner when he was with LA. I think he brings a lot to this team if he can put, as he did last year, 116, 117 WRC plus, really get in there against those key matchups, get him in there against tough lefties, things like that, maybe areas that you want Bush to get experience in. But if, and this is my thing with Shaw too, like the balance of development and winning games gets very tricky, especially when you're a fringe team like the Cubs. Like, you do have to balance, like, we want Bush and Shaw facing tough matchups, PCA too, that, they maybe aren't the best in and need to make those adjustments. You got to win games too. So how does Craig Counsell balance that? But overall, I'm quite pleased with Turner. I think that does doesn't answer, if you feel like Matt Shaw needs more development time, or, knock on wood, he gets hurt or something like that. I don't know what the answer is for who's playing third base on a day-to-day basis. And I still feel pretty uncomfortable about that. But adding Turner to the infield depth, I think, helps the entire situation, even if it may not be directly at third base. But again, remains to be seen. Dansby covers a lot of ground. If Justin Turner can just stand there maybe and just pick comes at him, like, I don't know, maybe that works.
Yeah, I think, and to your point, that the balance of development over versus winning, this is a season, I think, where the scales have been tipped as far toward winning as we've seen them in a while, because the patience for we're developing players, we're rebuilding, we're whatever, I think has really worn pretty much completely thin.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. I think, fans who are frustrated with the 83 wins and we're coming just shy of the playoffs, fans who are fed up with that are right in feeling that way. So that's going to factor in even more, where you watch what happens with Shaw closely, because if it does start to appear as if he needs more development, then I think they are going to err toward maybe he is in AAA, and then they've got to figure out what happens from there. Or if he is on the major league roster, then, as I said earlier, maybe you are really like weighing out those matchups super carefully, so he's not starting super often, or he's leaving games when the bullpen comes in because those matchups aren't favorable. And yeah, I guess it's possible that you could figure out a way to make Justin Turner a serviceable third baseman again. But yeah, I think his value is going to come from what he can do at the plate. But also, one of the things that the Cubs, to their credit, have done pretty well with over the last 10 years or so is when they bring guys in, I think they are mindful of things like clubhouse presence, the impact that they're going to have on the overall team culture. And so I don't know. I mean, I've been around Justin Turner 2-3 times, never really spoken to him much directly. So I can't speak to what kind of a guy he is behind the scenes. But I trust at least that the front office would have vetted that kind of thing carefully, so that, if it was a veteran who's like, I don't really like dealing with rookies, maybe they're less apt to bring him on, especially given these current circumstances. Because no, Michael Busch isn't a rookie, and he's an older second year player anyway, but he still is a young guy who doesn't have a ton of major league experience yet, who would benefit from some mentorship. But then even more so when you have Matt Shaw, who, as I said earlier, no major league at-bats, young. He's only been in professional baseball for a couple of years, period. So the chance to spend a lot of time around somebody like Justin Turner, who has all the resume that guy has, is hugely beneficial behind the scenes. So I trust that they would talk to the right people to get a sense for like who he is, how he operates, and what he's going to bring.
Well, and even they can talk to Michael Busch.
Yeah,
Michael Busch was like, "Oh man, that dude,
yeah, that guy sucks." Yeah,
oh
no, for sure, because they were in the same organization, so
yeah,
they know each other to some extent already, and that's he probably is one of the first guys that I would imagine they checked in with. But
yeah,
not only that, just whatever connections they have with Dodgers players or people in that organization, like, hey, what's Turner like? And checking with the Mariners too. But yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to like about this signing, because I think he's quietly going to add a lot to the team, that some of which you will see in the box score, and a lot that you won't.
Yeah. And I think too, different than, and then we will hit our first ad break here, but I do think different in past years in that this is not a guy they're bringing in to start. If he's starting every day, that means that something has gone wrong somewhere else. And you compare that to different years, they were bringing in some of these guys that didn't work out. Brendan doesn't always like when I say some of their names, but those guys were there to start. Like that was a sort of failed exercise in a lot of ways. And this is different, like they brought in, Eric Hosmer, Trey Mancini. Like, of course you had Matt Mervis, wanting to get time, but they brought those guys in to get significant innings. You look at,
to be the first
even
baseman,
Andrelton Simmons or Jonathan VR, those guys were brought in to play. Like, so I think, and even how it worked out last year, like they wanted it to be Morel at third base, but they did that late. And, so I think this is different in that they're not bringing him in to start. I feel like they likely have a very clear idea of how he can hit, how it'll work at Wrigley Field, the matchups they want to get him in, and just having that extra depth. But I think this should be a situation, some people are like, he's 40. What happens if this is another one of these old guys that comes over, craters, and plays for 4 months before the Cubs, they wait for all of us to be pulling our hair out when they're in the lineup every day. I don't think that that's going to be this situation. And I would certainly hope that they are quicker at identifying, like, this guy's literally 40 years old. If it looks like it, move on, like be quick and be a little more aggressive. But I think the concern on my end for that is a lot lower, because this is not a situation where he's being brought in to be the starting third baseman. Like, that's Matt Shaw's job. I don't even know if Justin Turner can play it. And if he's coming to play first base, it's on days when Michael Busch needs a day off or matchups you don't like for him. It is not to start at first base, say as your primary DH. It's not to start at DH either. So hopefully we don't have a repeat of those situations. You get a guy that can add a good bit to your lineup in terms of consistency, approach, things like that, the veteran leadership, et cetera, and just sort of strengthen that depth. But let's hit our first ad break here, and we'll come back, talk about, more of the depth and maybe the Canario thing. I think that all kind of ties together. Our first sponsor is Lucy Nicotine, our friends at Lucy Nicotine. If you are heading to spring training, Jared and I are, of course, in the cold, but, you're walking the backfields, standing out in the hot Arizona sun. At Lucy Nicotine, going to be the perfect thing for that. 100% pure nicotine, no tobacco, always tobacco free. You can get the Lucy Breakers, which are nicotine pouches with an extra surprise. Each pouch holds a capsule that can be broken open to release extra flavor and hydration. They have a ton of great flavors. You got the mango, pomegranate, apple ice, cinnamon, whatever floats your boat. They have a flavor for you. You can level up your nicotine routine with Lucy. Go to lucy.co/CHGO. Excuse me, my ad read is moving as I'm saying this. So I want to make sure I give you guys the right code. Lucy.co/CHGO and use promo code CHGO2025 to get 20% off your first order. Lucy has a 30-day refund policy if you change your mind. Again, that is lucy.co and use code CHGO2025 to get 20% off.
Well, and I know that Corey, you and I are here in the Chicago area right now, but there are a lot of fans who are headed down to Arizona or maybe in Arizona as they listen to this, and you might need a way to get around the Phoenix metro area. And so they should definitely check out Waymo. Waymo is an autonomous ride-hailing service that operates in the Phoenix metro area. These cars entirely drive themselves using cameras, LiDAR, and radar. Over the past few years, their service has grown to serve a majority of the Phoenix Valley, and they provide a safer, more eco-friendly ride-hailing service for everyday customers. If you're in the Phoenix area, you know that all of the ballparks are pretty close together, which is nice, and you're often going to be looking for a way to get around from ballpark to ballpark. So Waymo is the way to go. I was down there last year, saw the Waymo cars all over the place. It's it's an amazing thing to see, and especially watching these people ride, sitting there in the back where they're being driven by this car, and it looks very futuristic and cool. Their ride hailing service consists entirely of all electric Jaguar I-Pace vehicles. They provide a consistent zero emission experience for their riders. They are currently doing about 150,000 trips per week across San Francisco, Los Angeles, and again, Phoenix. So if you're headed down to the Cactus League, you can check these guys out. They were the first company to serve a fully autonomous ride with no human behind the wheel in 2015. So they've been doing this for 10 years. Waymo has over 40 million miles of real world driving experience. That's enough to drive to the moon and back 80 times. So if you're headed out to Arizona for spring training, download the Waymo One app and get ready to experience the future.
Different times, Jared. We got cars driving around by themselves. So
it's like the Jetsons.
Yeah,
you know?
It's pretty cool.
I mean, I did like seeing those cars drive around the Phoenix area last year. I felt a little bit like I had stepped into the future. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. All right, back into Cubs baseball, and I want to talk a little bit about the Canario thing. Obviously, it pairs with Justin Turner. It was the corresponding move. But, again, I think, Luke and Cody talked about this on Thursday, but it was a surprise to a lot of people. This was a guy, obviously comes over in the Chris Bryant trade, that was never a top prospect, but certainly a name we've been following. A lot of, really clear raw tools, especially on the power side. But another one of those guys, Jared, that, and it similarly pairs to what we were just sort of saying about kind of trying to time development and winning at the same time. I think in particular, back to with Nelson Velasquez too, it was a very similar vibe. Like in 2023 with David Ross, saying we're going to ride with the guys that got us here. And that didn't include, those young guys. And, 2024 as well, like trying to get PCA playing time while you have Ian Happ and Seiya Suzuki playing the way that they were, that there just wasn't a lot of room for these guys. And I think the only thing that really stood out to me, I trust their, evals on these guys. I think if they have gotten to the point, Canario never had the kind of like flawless minor league numbers that,
right.
You're thinking like, yeah, this guy's a slam dunk. There were still, swing issues and, contact things and stuff like that, typically it's a lot to overcome to be routinely successful at the MLB level. But it did jump out to me as, kind of, I think all these conversations pair together, and it's easy to sit in hindsight and say these things. And I don't even know that I would sit here now and say, well, they should have done this with this player at this time. But I do feel like, and it's, again, not to suggest that these guys are like all-stars the Cubs are missing out on, because rarely do we look back at some of these and be like, man, the Cubs really screwed that up. But it does feel like, they have given a lot of playing time to older, bad players. And,
yes.
There was that time, it was in hindsight, where Canario was at the MLB level and just sitting on the bench. And it is certainly possible that the front office saw what they needed to see. They know what the, kind of internal evaluation is. And it's not a direct 1-for-1, like Trey Mancini wasn't eating playing time from Alexander Canario, but it is one of those things where you look and go, okay, like just something to think about, just kind of how the organization operates. And I do think it pairs well with that Justin Turner conversation, because it's kind of a similar thing where it's like, I like that signing. I love the kind of thinking behind it. But if it's not there and you are sitting there going, oh, this guy looks 40, like all of a sudden, the skills have vanished, kind of like they did with Yan Gomes.
And it can go quick
about that.
Sometimes. Yeah.
And I understand why some fans are going to say, this guy didn't even get an opportunity, and you wanted him to fill in at first base that you decided to give him experience on 2 weeks ago. Again, that's not me sitting here saying I'm a big Alexander Canario believer. How could they possibly do this? I just think it's interesting to look back at the last few years and kind of compare and contrast, like, okay, they have had some bad depth signings. They have had some wasted money, stuff like that. Should these guys have gotten more of an opportunity? Or, you look at a situation like with Matt Mervis, for example, like I would like them to have given him that experience the fall prior. So you kind of had an idea going into that season. But at the same time, like, he did get a decent run at the MLB level, much more than plenty of prospects get. And he was never a top prospect anyway. And he didn't take the ball and run with it. And so as fickle as it all is, like, you may only get 100 plate appearances. And if they're not good ones, and you look overmatched and, you can't hit a big league fastball, whatever it is, the organization doesn't have a ton of time to make those decisions. So it's a lot of rambling from me. And I don't really have a clear conclusion. I just think as we watch this baseball team, and, we're obviously part of the group that is dissecting every little thing that they're doing and regretting it in hindsight, being angry about it in foresight, whatever it might be. It's just interesting to think about. It was a surprise to kind of get to this point, to see him DFA'd on Thursday morning. I don't think it's some egregious error, but it's just, sort of one of those things you go back and look at kind of all the pieces and how they got here to make that decision.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point out the fact that there have been a lot of examples in the last few years of older players who are brought in to fill certain roles who don't pan out, or who work out for a short period of time, but then they lose it pretty quickly. I mean, Yan Gomes is a good example of that. He was really solid in 2023, and then it just fell off in 2024. Or sometimes, an older player, that's just when it goes, it goes. And you wonder, are they setting themselves up for that with Justin Turner at the expense of having given some opportunity to a younger player who might still have some untapped potential or some ability to continue developing with the right amount of opportunity? Because I think last season a lot of fans felt frustrated by the fact that Canario and one or two of these other young guys would get called up, but then would get maybe one at bat or one spot in the lineup once a week here and there, and it was like you kind of forget that they were even there because they just weren't getting that playing time. And that's sort of the concern then, is like, have they done this again where you have a young player where you might be missing out on something here? I don't know that that's really the case, but I think that's a fair concern to have. But ultimately, I go back to, what's your primary objective as a team? And that is, it's time to win, and it's time to win the division. It's time to actually get into the playoffs and, make a real playoff run. With nobody, like I said earlier, the patience with the 83 win type teams is worn thin, but I think even more so, there's not necessarily going to be a lot of patience for, oh, hey, we won the division and got into the NLDS, but then lost in that first round. I don't think fans are going to be satisfied just by getting back into the playoffs. The bar is a lot higher.
Yeah.
The expectation is that at least you feel like you have a legitimate shot at another World Series team. Because for as great as everybody felt after 2016, when they finally won that World Series, all of us went into that believing at the time that this was like the first step toward, a Cubs dynasty, because that's what it seemed like they had set themselves up for. And so the expectation was, you won in 2016, they're going to turn around, and whether it's the next year or the year after that, that there would be another opportunity at least to win a World Series. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into this, but we saw how quickly they fell off. I mean, they went from that to, you're losing the division in game 163 and losing the wild card game just 2 seasons later, and then it's like it's gone, it's over. And so because of that, I think that's a part of why fans feel a lot of we want to get back to that place. We want to get back to that level and feel like there's a chance to see this Cubs team do something like that again. And I think that's a lot of the reason why they might have a shorter runway for some of these younger players who either, like you said, go out, they get their 100 plate appearances or so and don't really show that they can handle it. So it's like, all right, that's it. Or maybe in Canario's case where there weren't a ton of major league appearances, but their team evaluators had seen what they needed to see, had made their judgments about what he was capable of and said, we're comfortable with DFAing this guy for a 40-year-old Justin Turner.
Yeah. And, again, it's hard to know the right answer. I think it's easy to sit here now and say like, well, yeah. And people were saying at the time, like, I wish he had gotten more run last year and really gotten kind of sustained run. But, again, like the team was loosely, call it competitive for a good chunk of last year. It's tough when, and especially in Canario's case, you have a guy that's, somewhat limited defensively. And, again, still would need to adjust in a significant way at the MLB level for that power to show. Raw power is great. It's got to show up in the game. Right. And, you look at this team, like that's why he's taking balls at first base. Like there's not space anywhere else. You have an elite defender in center field. You have a Gold Glover multi-time in left field. You've got Kyle Tucker now, King Tucker in right field. Like not a lot of space. So versatility, kind of the name of the game. And like you kind of have to be able to show that stuff in what might be a pretty short sample. I think it is just easy to wonder, I think, like, man, over the last like couple of years, there was no, space to try some of these guys. Cause I think it is interesting as I was thinking about this, like the juxtaposition of the job I think that they've done at creating depth internally on the pitching side and giving guys those opportunities versus on the position side. It does feel and they're completely different areas of the game, but you look on the pitching side, like they did hunt internal upside on the pitching side. Like they have tried any number of these guys as relievers, starters. They gave huge runway to a guy like Javier Assad to specifically do that. Hey, instead of going out and spending money in free agency, like let's try these guys as starters. Let's give them starts. Let's stretch them out so that they can let's give these guys these opportunities. Like same a good bit in the bullpen. And it just feels like on the position side, it has been kind of a little bit of the opposite. Like let's air to veterans and established kind of things. But again, like I hate when I feel like I'm not really like offering like a conclusion. But I don't know that there needs to be one. Like it's tough to know what the right answer is. And, I do want to make it clear, like, I'm not sitting here like, how could they not play Alexander Canario? Like, I don't feel that way at all. I just think it's interesting to look back at a guy who had value as a prospect, was looked at in a higher light, certainly than he is today. And, not really getting too much run at the big league level and ultimately, not even being a part of a trade, that like significantly brings something back for the Cubs, but, sort of unceremoniously DFA'd on the first day of Cactus League play here. Not saying it's the wrong decision. I'm not saying the process is wrong. But, just as we sit here year over year, it's one of those things we can look back and kind of analyze. I don't think that there's a different world, Jared, where the Cubs are heading to playoffs with a 3-4-5 in their lineup of Matt Mervis, Nelson Velasquez, and Alexander Canario. Like, I don't think that. I think likely they will not regret any of those decisions. And I don't think, Nelson hit some bombs for Kansas City, but overall, like, where was he going to play? Was that going to happen here? And was that even good enough to warrant worrying about? And I think the answer to all of that is no. But it's just, one of those things you look back and you pay attention to these guys as prospects for so long. It's easy to sort of,
You get invested in
Yeah.
in their development, in their growth. Yeah, you, even if they're not major leaguers, you spend years kind of talking about these players, following their development, following their progress. These are names that are on your mind for a long time before they ever touch the major league roster, if they ever do at all. So when they do get to that point, there is kind of you want to at least see that they've gotten a chance. It's disappointing when you get super excited about a player, he comes up and just doesn't produce the way that you think he can. I think Matt Mervis is a good example of that. There was a ton of excitement about that guy, and it just didn't come to fruition. But yeah, you want to at least feel like that the player has gotten that fair shake. But I think, like you were saying earlier about their pitching development compared to their development of players, that in the lineup, what's interesting to me is it's kind of like, as an organization, I think they do a pretty good job of figuring out, this is what our formula is right now. This is what we think is going to work for us right now. You look at the organization in past years and how they put together successful teams, it looked a little different. They had this army of young position players coming up and having a big impact on the World Series team. And so I think to some extent we're still kind of waiting to see that happen again, because it was so successful 10 years ago or so. But I think the formula has kind of flipped in a way, because they have gotten really good at kind of finding these diamond in the rough type pitchers, developing these guys from their system who turn out to be pretty good and pretty versatile. And then also like plucking relievers out of other organizations and getting something from them that those other teams weren't. I mean, we've seen that so often over the last few years. So I'm kind of like, I sort of enjoy that aspect of it, and just looking at like, hey, they've turned into an organization that's kind of pretty good with their pitchers. And yeah, maybe you do get the frustration of position players who aren't as good as some of the guys we were used to a few years ago, and not getting some of those prospects that come up and are impactful in that way. But man, when you look at what they're putting on the mound, that's where that might be where the excitement is, especially when it comes to younger players.
Yeah. And, I think too, especially on the thought of like, should these guys have gotten more runway, stuff like that? Like, I don't like to defer to authority, but I would say like something I always try to keep in mind is there is, I think, quite literally nothing that Jed would like more than cheap, controlled, young talent on the offensive or defensive side. So that doesn't mean that Canario can't go somewhere else, or Nelson Velasquez or any of these guys can't go somewhere else and succeed. But if the Cubs believed that was going to happen, and they believed in their evals and the tools and the work that they could do, they have all these talented people they bring in to teach hitting, teach pitching, these cameras, data, all this other stuff. Like, if they believed they could do it, they would, because especially pairing with all of this break-even budget, all this other stuff, I promise you there is nothing better for Jed Hoyer than like a middle-of-the-order power hitter that he can pay $800,000, right? So doesn't mean that they can't get this stuff wrong, but I promise you, like, they would have rather put Alexander Canario at first base if they thought that would work than paying Justin Turner $6 million. Like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it doesn't, it doesn't make that wrong, but like, that's how I always try to think about some of that stuff. We should hit our second ad break here, and then we'll come back and, keep the conversation going, talking about depth and spring training and everything else. But our first sponsor here is Hooters. You guys know it, an iconic brand, wings, ice cold beer, an experience like nothing else. And there is no better way to experience Chicago sports than at your local Hooters. Hooters is so special. They care about their people, the food they serve, their guests, and their community. every Tuesday in February through the 25th. Your wing cravings can make a difference. Hooters is donating a portion of chicken wing sales to Holy Family Schools, helping fund tuition, books, classroom supplies, and more for kids in under-resourced communities. With the support of Chicagoland Hooters family, they have raised over $1 million since 1992, and we can keep that going. Hot wings, cold beer, and your favorite cheerleaders, the Hooters girls. 9 out of 10 Hooters girls agree that eating wings while watching the game will help your team win. If that's the case, I feel like we got to get Cody and Luke to Hooters as much as possible this summer, because we need more than 83. Jared.
Often as they can. Yes.
Cheer on your favorite teams from any of the 11 Chicagoland Hooters locations: Aurora, Countryside, Downers Grove, Joliet, Lansing, Melrose Park, Oaklawn, O'Hare, Orland Park, Schaumburg, Wells Street. You can order online for pickup and delivery, and you can check them out at originalhooters.com.
Well, Corey, just a few days ago, earlier this week, I was at the Chicago Auto Show, which was pretty exciting. And right now, the auto show deals are going on at Ray Chevrolet in Fox Lake. That means that the latest vehicles you've been looking for are now priced with huge auto show savings. Savings like $11,000 off MSRP on new Chevy models. Or you can check out their selection of over 125 vehicles priced under $20,000. With one of Chicagoland's largest Chevy inventories, you're sure to find the perfect vehicle for you. And as one of the top selling Chevy dealers in the Midwest, they're able to keep their prices competitive, so you know that you're going to get a great deal. Plus, Ray's price promise lets you shop confidently because a guarantee of no add-ons, no hidden fees, no gimmicks. That means the price you see is the price you pay. You don't have to worry about price changing, stressful negotiating, or any tricks. The people at Ray Chevrolet just want to help you get into the right vehicle at the right price. Go see for yourself. Visit our partner this February at their convenient location right on Route 12 in Fox Lake. And don't miss out on their auto show sales event going on all month long throughout the month of February. Be the star of the show and take $11,000 off MSRP today by shopping Ray Chevrolet in Fox Lake or at raychevrolet.com. They've been serving the community since 1963. Together, let's drive.
All right, Jared. So, finishing it off too. I mean, it all, the Canario thing plays too, I think, just looking, obviously, you expect Justin Turner to have significant, play that depth role and, fill in those starts and things like that. But even looking at, how they structured the lineup on Thursday, you have Vidal Brujan in center field. It's one of those things, like I said, I would try not to overreact to overall performances and lines and things like that. But spring training does offer a little bit of a peek inside, kind of like what the organization is thinking, where they want guys getting work, where they might go if things head a certain direction. And, like Brujan's an interesting one, like former top prospect, but, similarly to the conversation we just had, like not good showings at the MLB level,
right?
But toolsy, and we'll see, is this a guy that they kind of view as a backup at some of these positions and things like that. But yeah, I mean, when you DFA a guy you got in a pretty big trade, and you see kind of how it does offer a little bit of insight to sort of just like what skills they're valuing, which guys they, maybe want to see through a little bit more. And as we were kind of talking about, again, like Gage Workman getting things started at third base with a home run on Thursday. Those are the things to kind of keep an eye on. And it's hard to say, like, does someone earn the job with a certain line or because they hit a bunch of home runs and stuff like that. And, of course, we all know, like, and I have nothing but respect for the guy, but like David Bodie, an example of like a spring training legend, right? didn't always really carry over into the regular season. But, it was one of those spring trainings. It felt like he was homering every other day.
Right.
But it doesn't always translate. So it's not always clear, like, what does a guy need to do to earn that job? The bullpen, I think, is a fascinating area of this, because you have certain guys like Eli Morgan is a really interesting one to me, like successful with Cleveland. They bring him over in a trade, but has an option. Like, I don't expect them to necessarily want to use it, but are they forced to, because they don't want to get rid of some other guys that maybe do look good, and you got to keep them
and
on
they
the
want
roster
to give that
for
chance
now.
to.
Yeah. So there's a lot to pay attention to, just to see how it develops over the next month or so.
And I think, and Brujan is a good example of sometimes where he had, maybe there's more defensive flexibility there. I think his advantage comes in some part from he's useful in more spots on the field where they think they can use him in that way. That outweighs the power potential of Canario's bat, because he wasn't as didn't have the same amount of defensive flexibility. That plays a big role as well. But yeah, I agree. I think seeing how this bullpen's going to shake out is going to be really interesting, because they brought in a lot of new faces. There's a lot of new guys there, and people who sort of have some established roles, or at least in the past have played certain types of roles out of the bullpen. I mean, Presley's like the most obvious example, where it seems as though he's been brought in to at least, like, you're our closer unless something else develops and it's really shown otherwise. But I was very intrigued by Porter Hodges' performance late last season and what he was able to do in September. That's super small sample there, but I think to do that at the major league level during the season at least puts him in a conversation for, is this somebody who's going to start to slot into some of those later innings? He's not necessarily going to close games maybe, but is he somebody you're turning to in the 7th, 8th inning in a more high leverage spot because of how he performs last season? But yeah, with so many of these, Eli Morgan, this Cody Poteet who started Thursday's game, was Colin Ray, some of these other like veteran players who came in. How flexible are they with some of their roles? How much can they be moved around? And how is that impacted by who's got options, who doesn't? Where some of the surprises we might see in roster decisions might boil down to that, where maybe Eli Morgan's a good example of, he could have a great spring, but he has an option and somebody else doesn't, and they want to at least give the opportunity to the other guy. And so they may say, okay, Morgan, you're not going to break camp with the major league team, because we need to at least give some opportunity to fill in the blank player. And that could be where some of the surprises come from, is because of things like that.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued by that. As Brendan will always say, like, I'm not a big spring training guy. I've watched enough, minor league baseball, college baseball, Arizona League baseball, et cetera, in my life, for work or otherwise, that I can't really get up for anything other than, like a real honest to goodness Cubs game. But I do like paying attention to this stuff. And obviously I love this team and dialed in on their success or failure. So I am watching this stuff, and I am curious, who is getting the runway, who has a clear path, or, feel like it's a position for them to lose or not. I want to ask, in our last few minutes here, as the Cubs have started playing games, we're about a month from them actually having games that count and things like that. The offseason maybe isn't totally over, but it feels like mostly over, at least as far as their spending. And if you're paying attention to what their budget probably is and things like that, like, there probably isn't much, if anything, left anyway. How do you feel? How do you feel about it? How do you feel about the offseason? And I guess they pair together, but maybe separately, like, just how this team stacks up in this division and in the National League as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first part of that question, I would say I actually feel pretty good about the offseason they've had. I think there's a lot of focus that's been placed on some of what hasn't gone the way that we hoped, like Roki Sasaki choosing the Dodgers, some of these other players that it looked like the Cubs were in on going elsewhere, Alex Bregman not working out. So it's easy to get caught up in some of those negatives, but when you step back and you look at what they've done to this roster, they are, at least on paper. I remember we talked about this like a year ago about your margin for error with your wins and losses and needing to get that up to a certain level where maybe your ceiling is 90 plus wins so that your floor isn't quite so low. And I do feel like, compared to where they were a year ago, I do genuinely feel like right now that they have boosted that number. So maybe they're going to float closer to 87, 88 wins, which means they could win 92. But maybe at worst they win 83 again, which would be frustrating.
If they do it 3 in a row, we should get something for that.
There's got to be, right, like some kind of make a shirt if nothing else. But so yeah, on that front, I do feel that they have genuinely improved. Kyle Tucker has a lot to do with that. But as I said earlier, I genuinely think that bullpen is going to be a lot stronger than it was a year ago because they lost a lot of games in 2024 because the bullpen wasn't what it needed to be. So I feel much, much better there. So if I'm giving this a grade, I'd give this a solid B+. It wasn't an amazing offseason. It wasn't this outstanding offseason, but it was certainly very good. And I feel pretty happy about it. That said, are they ready to be competitive with the Dodgers, the Phillies, and some of these really strong teams in the National League? I'm not quite convinced yet. I just, that part of it, I don't feel quite as confident about. I do think they can genuinely, they have a shot at winning this division, but are they capable of doing much beyond that? That's where I'm not quite so sure.
Yeah. I think we're pretty aligned on that. I feel like B+ feels a little high for me, but
it might be a little generous. So I'll admit that, but I'm an optimist by nature.
I guess, yeah, I feel definitely better. I think you're spot on. The floor feels higher. You never know how things are going to work out, but as we talked about, you just had the bottom of your roster in the last couple of years was real bad. I mean, at certain points, like they were rostering at different times, like the worst player in the league, like the worst qualified player in the league. And things, best laid plans, right? Like I think the Turner thing is sound. I think if he went south, it would be a bit of a surprise, even though his age, but just looking at everything, it doesn't necessarily suggest that that's imminent. Similar for someone like Yan Gomes, but at the same time, people will say he's 37-year-old catcher. Like maybe you couldn't have predicted it, right, but should you have, I think they've raised the floor in a lot of different areas. And I am hopeful that we also see a little bit more from Craig Counsell in the sense that should have his feet under him with the organization, has some more of his own decisions with the coaching staff and the players and these things, and even just the players that he does have, just a more familiarity with them. And, being able to kind of attack things with a lot more knowledge. And that's not to make excuses for the first year, but I do think that stuff matters. So I'm hopeful that, especially as you said, with a lot of the work they've done to this bullpen to bring in these guys, that Counsell is now, has that familiarity. He and Hottovy have more of a working relationship. He understands these players better. And, we kind of avoid, because it did feel, last year they blew so many games, but at the same time, you have a new manager coming over. You did have 3 top guys kind of earmarked for the top of that bullpen, and they got hurt. They didn't perform. They got hurt again. They didn't perform again. It's tough for me to put that on Craig Counsell, right? Like he's coming in. This is the top of the depth chart, and he used it, and it just didn't work. That doesn't feel like it's on him. So I think that familiarity will be good. Yeah. to your point, like I feel like the standard for this organization, especially this many years removed from a playoff appearance, a division title, a pennant, all that other stuff, I need them to get to a solid, like, this is no question a top team in the National League. And as you said, even if things don't go well, they should still be, we've seen this with teams before. The Dodgers had 1,000 injuries last year. They still won a ton of games because that's built in. When we talk about the win projection, it's not just, Pacoda said. They're positioned in a spot where stuff can go wrong, and they still should, by all accounts, be successful. And the Cubs haven't reached that point. But I feel good about them in their standing in the division. They're lucky that basically everybody else decided to just like opt out of the offseason or get worse in some ways. But, that's the nature of things. We'll take the advantage where we can. So I feel, I don't know, maybe like a B minus. But some of that is going to be judged in hindsight. I think the main thing for me is I remain concerned that there is so much pressure on Matt Shaw to succeed. And I have no doubt that he can do it and handle it. And I'm a big believer in his. But, again, for a team that might be fighting for a division title or fighting game by game for a wild card spot, like, and maybe Gage Workman shows us this spring that they do have it, but that right away jumps out to me as like, okay, I mean, if you're in a pennant race and you don't have a third baseman for any reason, for Matt Shaw's own doing or not, luck, things like that, I don't know. And I think that's one of those areas where, they were going after Bregman, they were going after starters, they were going after high-priced relievers. They didn't really get any of those things. So we talked about that last week. Are those areas that they know are kind of weaknesses and they were willing to spend a bunch of money to kind of fix them? Would that have been in their mind just sort of supplemental, take us to that next level? We'll see. But either way, this is how stuff worked out. This is the group for the most part. Maybe another signing or two, but they'd have to be very small based on what we know. So be interesting to follow. So I think that's what we have for you, Jared. As always, appreciate you hopping in here. I don't know if you have anything specific you want to direct anyone's attention to other than your general work at ALLCITY.com, but obviously direct us where you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, just a heads up for all of our listeners and readers, I will be out in Mesa next week. So I'll be giving you some firsthand reporting down there beginning on Thursday for a few days. So looking forward to that.
Cool. Yeah. So obviously check all of that out. Brendan and I will be back with you next Friday. Appreciate your support for everything going on at CHGO. We will talk to you again soon. And as always, go Cubs.